One of the first astronomical features that our ancestors noticed was the way that the shape of the moon changed in a repeating pattern. It didn't take them long to work out the phases of the lunar cycle, and they established two stages of that cycle as important days. The phase began as a tiny crescent, then waxed larger until after 15 days it was full. These were the two moments that were assigned great significance by early humans, representing the beginning of a new cycle and the climax of it, when the moon was full. At this early stage of Israelite history and the development of a calendar, there was no structure of a 7-day week. The days were marked according to the number of days that had passed since the sliver of the new moon was first sighted, and the counting began again with the sighting of the next new moon. Although this may seem a little rudimentary to us, there was probably something very reassuring about this cycle to our ancestors as they marked the passage of time. I suspect that many of us have struggled in recent months to remember what day it is. Had we been watchers of the moon, or even able to see it, we might have found an alternative way to observe the passage of time during lockdown. One of the first astronomical features that our ancestors noticed was the way that the shape of the moon changed in a repeating pattern. It didn't take them long to work out the phases of the lunar cycle and establish two stages of that cycle as important days. The phase began as a tiny crescent and then waxed larger until after 15 days it was full. These were the two moments that were assigned great significance by early humans, representing the beginning of a new cycle and the climax of it when the moon was full. At this early stage of Israelite history and the development of a calendar, there was no structure of a 7-day week. Days were marked according to the number that had passed since the first sliver of moon was sighted, and the counting began again with the sighting of the next new moon. Although this may seem a little rudimentary to us, there was probably something very reassuring about this cycle to our ancestors as they marked the passage of time. I suspect that many of us have struggled in recent months to remember what day it is. Had we been watchers of the moon, or at least able to see it, we might have found an alternative way to observe the passage of time during lockdown. We base our calendar on the amount of time it takes for the Earth to revolve around the Sun, 365 and a quarter days, 12 months. But 12 lunar months only adds up to 354 days, which means that there's a discrepancy every year. Israelite calendar demands that its festivals fall at certain seasons. Pesach, as we'll talk about later, is a spring festival. Sukkot is an autumn festival. And if there were no adjustments made to the calendar, then eventually Pesach would end up in the winter and Sukkot would be in the middle of summer. So how is this adjustment made? Well, they weren't consciously making an adjustment all those years ago. Our ancestors did it much more simply than that. When winter came, they cooped up in their houses and sheltered from the bad weather, and then kept an eye on each new moon. And as soon as there was a new moon and the weather looked better and green shoots had begun to appear and spring was in the air, they declared that this was the first month of the new year. And if it was the 12th month and there was still no sign of any green shoots, then they simply stayed indoors for another month. So it was 13 months between the last new year and this one. So it was based purely on human observation of the state of the seasons as to whether a lunar year had 12 or 13 months. And once spring had been sighted and was in the air when the new moon was first spotted, the full moon that followed immediately from that one was declared to be an important festival, the spring festival, which we now celebrate as Pesach. And from that moment, once it had been established that this was the beginning of spring and the beginning of the new year, when the months were counted, there would be exactly 6 months until the harvest festival, and the full moon was the day when it happened. So the full moon of the first month, which we now call Nisan, would have been Pesach, and exactly 6 months later, on the full moon of the 7th month, they would have celebrated the harvest festival, the festival of Sukkot, on the full moon, the 15th day of the Hebrew month of Tishri. So as I've said, we're currently at the full moon of the month of Elul. We are halfway through the 6th month since spring was first declared back in April, and we're making our way towards the beginning of the 7th month. For our ancestors, this would be a very hectic time because they knew that the 7th month was the occasion when they had to present themselves in Jerusalem with their crops and their harvest ready to celebrate the harvest festival on the full month of Tishri, which is just 4 weeks away, 29 or 30 days away from where we are right now. And so they would have frantically been gathering in their harvest to ensure that they were ready on time as the moon of Elul waned, moving towards the end of the 6th month of the year. And as the moon waned further and further and just pretty much disappeared, and then a tiny sliver of the next new month would reappear, this would be the moment when it was declared that the 7th month since the spring was declared had been arrived, and this was the important one. This was the beginning of the time that our ancestors had to take their crops and their harvest to Jerusalem. So in order to announce to them that this was an important moment in their calendar and it was time to get ready to go, a shofar would be blown throughout the land in all the tribes of Israel to alert people to the fact that this was the time to get to Jerusalem, ready for the harvest festival, which in the 7th month, which had just begun, was now only 14 days away. The other key element of nature on which our ancestors depended was rain. They desperately needed rain to fall during the festival of Sukkot because the ground after the summer was rock hard, and in order to be able to plant their crops, they needed rain to soften it, and then a little dry period to be able to plant the crops, and then more rain to water those newly planted crops. And that's exactly what happened in the land of Israel and still does at this time of the year. There's a short period of rain followed by 10 days or so of a kind of an Indian summer, and then more rain at the end of it all. And if it didn't rain, if it hadn't rained by the end of Sukkot, our ancestors were panicking, they were frightened. So part of Sukkot, as well as being a celebration of the harvest, was also a request for God to send rain. And the lulav, which is shaken at the festival of Sukkot, is in fact a very ancient form of rainmaking ritual. If you have thousands of people all standing together in the temple forecourt as they did, shaking a palm branch, it sounds like rain. So the urgency of rain was a real powerful element of the festival of Sukkot, as well as celebrating our ancestors had one eye on the sky in the hope that rain would begin to fall. Once our ancestors developed the concept that withholding rain might be something that an angry God would do if this God was displeased with human behavior, they decided to introduce an extra element to their harvest preparations. And once they'd gathered in their harvest, having been alerted to this at Rosh Hashanah when the moon of the 7th month was new, they headed for Jerusalem, and just 5 days before the full moon, before the celebration of Sukkot, they organized and implemented a national day of saying sorry, of atoning and apologizing to God for anything that they may have done wrong, in order to clean the slate, ready for a celebration of Sukkot that would be both joyful and would see the falling of rain because God had forgiven them for whatever they might have done wrong. And so we see there's a close connection between the festival of Sukkot, the observance of Yom Kippur, and the announcement of the 7th month, the first day of the 7th month at Rosh Hashanah. And back in our ancestors' days, it was the festival of Sukkot, the harvest festival, in an agriculturally based society that was the most important element of the festivals at this time of the year. Rosh Hashanah was an announcement that the 7th month had arrived and it was time to get ready for the harvest. Yom Kippur was introduced much later, once our ancestors had developed the concept that God punished human beings by withholding rain, and the way to offset that punishment was, they believed, to offer sacrifices and prayers just before the appearance of the full moon so that God would forgive them and would send the rain on time. So these festivals that we're on the verge of celebrating in the 7th month of our Jewish year are all very closely connected. And although Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur are now the ones on which we focus, back in our ancestors' day, they were just an introduction to the all-important festival of Sukkot. So I hope that's given a sense of perspective on where our ancestors were at this time and how important the moon is in the calculation of time and the passage of time in the Hebrew calendar. And as we acknowledge the full moon later this evening, it just remains for me to say, Adonai, Yishmor tzeitenu uvo'enu me'atav ad olam. Pray that God will guard our going out and our coming in now and always. Amen. Laila Tov, and stay safe. Welcome to Evenings in Elul. This is the 15th of these broadcasts, meaning that tonight is the 15th day of the month of Elul. And after sunset tonight, if there happens to be a break in the clouds, you'll be able to see a full moon because we are now at the full moon of the 6th month of the Hebrew calendar. The moon was an incredibly important element of how our ancestors marked time. And as you know, with the 7th month approaching, the 7th month since the beginning of the spring, the new year is arriving, Yom Kippur is arriving, and the festival of Sukkot will be here in exactly 1 lunar month's time. So what I'd like to do tonight is just look at the calendar and consider how it has affected the Jewish religion, with even all these thousands of years later, that the presence and the shape of the moon still makes an important contribution to our calendar.